Well, I wanted to talk today some ideas that have kind of fascinated me and about this conflict. Arab-Israeli, I guess, is well. Ruth made a very superb point that it really wasn't a conflict; it was a war, part of the Arabs against the Jews, and I think that's much closer to the truth. I think, though, that in many ways, this conflict has been a conflict between narratives, stories, and that the people who support Israel, and I count myself strongly one of them, we have done a poor job in formulating a narrative to combat the narrative on the other side, and that we ought to do better. And so, rather than just offer that criticism, I hope my remarks can some way point in the direction of how we might do that. When I look at the Durban conferences, along with what may happen tomorrow, the request for UN recognition of statehood and so forth, but more generally the general animus in the Middle East and elsewhere toward Israel and toward the Jews. What is that really about? Does the Durban conference, in suggesting that, claiming that Israel is a racist nation, are they really interested in reforming the people of Israel and curing them of their racism? Are they tomorrow really interested in becoming a state? In their animus toward the Jews, are they really interested and committed and bothered by the presence of Jews in the Middle East? I think what they're really interested in, all these things and others, is to establish the Palestinian people within a narrative of victimization, and that this is their ulterior goal, to see themselves and have themselves seen around the world as victims of colonialism, as victims of white supremacy. And if you listen to their language, it is the sort of language of colonial oppression. Abbas claiming that they have been occupied for 63 years. The word oppressed is constant, exploited, neo-colonial, and so forth. And so there is this what I call a poetic truth. Let me say a quick word about that. Sort of stealing from the idea of poetic license, where a writer will bend the rules in order to be more effective. A poetic truth works, I think, in a similar way. I'll give you one example of a poetic truth that comes from my group, Black Americans. We say that, America is a deeply, intractably racist society. Yes, it may not be as conspicuous today as it was before. Nevertheless, today it is there structurally and systemically. And so it is still there, and it still holds us back, and it still keeps us from the American dream. And so you come forward with all kinds of evidence to suggest that racism in America today is probably about 25th on the list of problems Black Americans have. One of the great untold stories of America is the moral growth and evolution we've had away from that old problem. Not to say that it's completely extinguished, but it absolutely no longer prevents the forward progress of any black in the United States. It doesn't. There is not any evidence to suggest that. All the evidence is to the contrary. And yet, it is still the center point, centerpiece of our American identity, is this idea that we are victimized by a fundamentally, incurably racist society. Well, poetic truths like that are marvelous because no facts and no reason can ever penetrate them. And one of the problems that I think the supporters of Israel have is that they are up against a poetic truth. And we keep hitting it with all the facts, and we keep hitting it with obvious logic and reason, and we are so obviously and conspicuously right that we assume it's going to have an impact, and it never does. Well, why not? Well, these narratives, these poetic truths, and in the case of the Palestinians, I'll just point to them for the moment. It is the source of almost the entire source of their power. Who would they be if they weren't victims of white supremacy? They'd be just poor people in the Middle East. They'd be backward. They'd be behind Israel in every way. So it is the source of their power. It's the source of their money. Money comes from around the world. It is the source of their self-esteem. Again, without it, would they be able to compete with the Israeli society? They would have to confront in themselves a certain inferiority with regard to Israel, as most other Arab nations would have to confront an inferiority in themselves and be responsible for it. Well, the idea that the problem is Israel and the problem is the Jews protects them from having to confront that inferiority or do anything about it or ever overcome it. And so the idea that among Palestinians, the idea that they are victims means more to them than anything else. It is everything. It is the centerpiece of their very identity. And it is a way they define themselves as human beings in the world. So it is not an idle thing, and our facts and reason are not going to easily penetrate that and make any progress. Well, how can you get away with a poetic truth, with an obvious series of falsehoods? One way you get away with it, or the way certainly it happens in the Middle East, is that the Western world, lacks the moral authority to call you on it. The Western world won't say, for example, what I just said, that your real problem is inferiority, your real problem is underdevelopment. That will never be said. It won't be said in the Western world because, after all, the Western world was once colonial, was once racist, did practice white supremacy, and is so ashamed of itself at this point, and is so vulnerable to to charges of it, that they're not going to say a word. They're not going to ever say what they really think and feel about what is so obvious about the circumstances among the Palestinians. And so the poetic truth that they live by carries on. Earlier speaker talked about the media and its devotion to three other speakers talked about the media and its looking for instances of Israelis victimizing Palestinians, overlooking every kind of instance to the contrary, Palestinians engaged in behavior like that. Because the media internationally, again, has no moral authority, or doesn't feel that it has the moral authority to actually say what they see, to go and report what they see. And so they feed this poetic truth, give it a kind of gravitas that it would never otherwise have. Well, my point again is that what this side needs to do is to develop a narrative that is not poetic, but that is literal and that is based on the truth. What would such a narrative what would it look like? Well, it would begin with the presumption that the problem in the Middle East is not white supremacy, but the end of white supremacy. That's the real problem. After World War II, when the empires began to contract, when the Middle East was left and Britain went home and France went home, or said they did, the Arab world was left there. It was almost abandoned, and in a state of much greater freedom than they had ever known before. But freedom is a dicey thing to experience, because when you come into freedom, you see yourself very accurately in the world. And what was clear when that part of the world and other parts of the world, and this, of course, is not unique to the Middle East. This, I believe, was also the Black American experience when we came in, when the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1964, and we came into much greater freedom. But if you were a janitor in 1963 and you're a janitor in 1965, and now you have all these freedoms and they're supported by the rule of law, then your actual experience of freedom is one of humiliation and one of shame. You see how far you have to go, how far behind you are, how little social capital you have with which to struggle forward. And now, even in freedom, you see you're likely to be behind for a long time. And so freedom, and again, your inability to compete, your underdevelopment, freedom becomes something that you're very likely going to hate. You're going to despise it because it, again, carries this humiliation. It's at that point that I think groups that have formerly oppressed groups develop what I'm calling bad faith. And what is bad faith? Bad faith is when you come into freedom, you're humiliated, and you say, well, you know, the real truth is I'm not free. Racism still exists. Zionism is my problem. The state of Israel is my problem. And that's why I'm so far behind, and that's why I can't get ahead. And so you begin to develop a culture grounded in bad faith, where you keep saying that you're less free than you are. Islamic extremism, of course, is the stunning example. I have to go on jihad because I'm fighting for my freedom. Well, you already have your freedom. You could stay home and study. You could do something constructive. But no, I can't do that because that makes me feel badly about myself. And so I live in a world of extremism. Dictators. Again, this is not unique to the Middle East. In Black America, we had exactly the same thing. After we get the Civil Rights Bill and get this greater degree of freedom, then all of a sudden we hear the words Black Power. Then all of a sudden we have the Black Panthers. Then we have this militancy, this picking up of the gun, because we feel bad about ourselves. We feel non-competitive, and this, in a sense, becomes a compensation. Jihadism throughout the Middle East, nigritude. It's a common pattern with the groups that felt, in a sense, that freedom felt abandoned by the West when they became free. And I think that in many ways, this is the narrative that the Palestinians have. This is the true narrative of their situation. This is the real story of the Palestinians and of the Middle East. And they will never be reasonable. They will never be reached by reason until they are somehow able to get beyond bad faith, to get beyond this sort of poetic truth that they are the perennial victims of an aggressive and racist Israeli nation. I think, again, my point is simply that it is, I think, a battle of the narratives. And this side of this narrative is one that at this point I think needs to be developed and used. It gives you a way to literally throw a punch back, to literally land a blow. It's not just a way to say that, because you have to explain your enemy before you can really be effective. And this, it seems to me, is what we have constantly used facts, constantly used reason, and really not gotten very far at all. Durban is a perfect example of bad faith, because Durban is a way of saying Israelis are racist and they're our problem. What Durban really is a way of saying, I'm not free. I'm still a victim. That's what I think its real purpose is, what they may do tomorrow in asking for recognition from the UN. Again, a perfect example of bad faith. Very likely they'll be turned down. Victim. I told you we were victims. I told you the West is racist, and so forth. It refuels the same sad identity. And of course, the irony is that, and the sadness, the tragedy of all this, is that it keeps these groups in a bubble where they never ever encounter or deal with the truth. This has been one of, I think, in many ways, well, I won't use the word I was about to use, but it is one of the things that becomes a second oppression for all these groups. They've been oppressed once. Now they're free, and they create a poetic truth that then oppresses them all over again. And how are you going to have good faith if you are raised being told that the society you're trying to compete in is against you and is racist and so forth? So it is always the Palestinians who suffer, and will just continue to suffer, because all of their energy is going into the avoidance of their situation, rather than into to being challenged by it and facing into it. And I think the strength of our argument, of the narrative, of if were this to become a narrative, is that it gives the Palestinians a way out. It points to a way out. Development is the way out. The West can help you. The West you can then be able to compete. It may take a little while, but it's either that, or you can get into this cycle of violence and hatred and poetic truths about you being victims and so forth. And of course, this whole pattern of bad faith, in certain places, comes to embrace a kind of ethic of death. It's what Osama bin Laden said. In the West, you are all afraid of death. We love death. Well, why would you love death? If you're not afraid of death, then you are aggrandized. You become a big man all of a sudden. You're not this little recently freed inferior. You're now somebody who manages, who conquers his world, and has power. And of course, terrorism is power, the power of the gun. And so that is that's where I think the poetic truth leads to, is this sort of terrible, inconceivable fascination with death and violence and guns and bombs and a whole part of the world consumed in that every single day. Rather than, again, doing the boring things that good faith require, going to school, raising your children, maybe invent some software, make a lot of money, so forth. So anyway, my point is simply to say that I hope our side does a better job of countering, coming up with a narrative that we can actually use against the other side. Thank you.